when you think about how people have lived and earned a living through history, we often picture farming, maybe cities, manufacturing.
Right, the settled stuff.
Exactly. But there are millions whose lives are built on something totally different. Movement. We're talking about nomadic pastoralists.
Yeah, the people who live by moving with their animal herds, often across landscapes where, settled farming just isn't really an option.
They might seem like figures from way back from a history book, maybe, but they are absolutely navigating the modern world right now.
And because their whole way of life is mobility, not settlement, their stories often get, sidelined in the usual history or economics classes.
Yeah. Oh, overlooked.
Yeah.
But they represent this huge, vital part of human existence, past and present.
Absolutely. Still do today.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into that world. We're using the sources you've brought together, articles, research notes.
Yeah, a real mix of material.
To explore the lives of these nomadic pastoralists, we're going to focus particularly on communities in India and Africa.
And the goal really is to understand their traditional ways, but also to uncover the massive impact things like colonial rule had.
Right. And how they've adapted. Their resilience is just incredible, how they've managed to survive and keep going despite enormous pressures.
It's a story filled with specifics, surprising details, all drawn from this material we have.
And it boils down to a core question, doesn't it? What actually happens when this complex, mobile way of life bumps up against fixed borders, state control, new economic forces?
Yeah, that clash is central. So where did the sources take us first? Where do we start seeing these patterns?
Let's start in India. A country we often think of for agriculture, but it's home to just an amazing diversity of pastoral communities, especially in the mountains and the drier zone.
That's right. Up in the north, in the Himalayas, you've got groups like the Gujar Bakarwals of Jammu and Kashmir, master herders, really, of goat and sheep.
And their whole year is this cycle of movement, isn't it?
A meticulously planned cycle. So in winter, they're down low in the Siwalik Hills. It's dry scrub forest there, but it provides grazing.
Okay.
But then comes spring, around April they gather. Often several households travel together in what they call a kafila.
A group movement?
Yeah, and they start this long march north, heading up.
Up into the high mountains, the summer pastures.
Exactly. They cross the Pir Panjal passes, these huge mountain ranges, to get into the Kashmir Valley. By summer, the snow's melted, and those high meadows are just bursting with green, nutritious grass.
Perfect for the herds.
Ideal. They graze there all summer. Then, late September, before the high passes get snowed in, they start the journey back down.
Back to the Siwaliks for the winter.
Right. And this constant movement, it's not random, it's essential. It lets the pastures they leave behind recover while they use others.
It sounds like a really sophisticated form of land management, sustainable even.
It absolutely is, rotating the use of these vast areas. And you see similar patterns with other groups there, like the Gadi shepherds in Himachal Pradesh.
They do a similar cycle.
Very similar. Winter in the Siwaliks, summer way up in places like Lahul and Spiti. The sources even mention they have specific stops on the way down in September for things like ritual bathing and shearing their sheep.
Fascinating detail. And what about the Gujar cattle herders a bit further east, Garhwal and Kuman?
Right. Many of those Gujars actually came over from Jammu looking for good pasture back in the 19th century. Their cycle is slightly different. It's winter down in the Pabar.
Pabar, what's that?
It's a dry forested area right at the foot of the Himalayas. Then in summer, they go up high, really high, into the Bugyals.
Bugyals, those are the high meadows.
Exactly. Vast natural mountain meadows, often above 12,000 feet, snow-covered in winter, but they just explode with grass and flowers after April.
Wow. So whether it's Gujars, Gadis, or the other groups mentioned like Bhotias, Sherpas, Canaries, the core Himalayan strategy is adapting movement to the seasons.
Absolutely. Using these dramatically different ecological zones at different times of the year. It's incredibly complex. Requires deep knowledge of the land, the weather, the animals.
But pastoralism in India isn't just a mountain thing.
Oh, no. You find major communities on the plateaus, the plains, even in the deserts.
Okay, like who?
Well, take the Dangars of Maharashtra. The sources say they were a huge community, maybe 500,000 people in the early 20th century. Shepherds, blanket weavers, buffalo herders, too.
And their movement isn't about snow, it's about the monsoon.
Exactly. Monsoon versus the dry season. So during the monsoon rains, they stay put on the central plateau. It's semi-arid, thorny scrub, mostly low rainfall.
Okay.
Good for dry crops like bajra, and it turns into a vast grazing area during the rains. But then, by October, After the bajra harvest,
May
they
move?
start moving west for about a month towards the Konkan region.
Oh, the coastal strip. Much wetter, more farming there.
Precisely. And this is where you see this amazing interdependence kick in. The Konkani farmers, the peasants there, have harvested their main crops. They actually welcome the dangar flocks.
Welcome them. Why?
Because the sheep manure the fields. It's fantastic fertilizer. Plus, they eat the stubble, clearing the fields, getting them ready for the next planting season.
That's brilliant. A win-win.
What do the dangars get out of it?
The farmers give them supplies, often rice, which is harder to come by, back on the plateau. Then, when the monsoon starts up again, the dangars head back inland. Their sheep don't do well in the heavy coastal rain.
So it's this perfect mutually beneficial exchange, manure for food, basically.
Exactly. It shows how deeply integrated these pastoralists were, not isolated wanderers, but part of regional economies and ecological cycles.
Really sophisticated.
And you find similar things elsewhere, like the Golas, who herd cattle, and the Kurumas and Kurubas, they herd sheep and goats, but are also weavers down in Karnataka and Andhra Pradesh.
Their movement is also tied to the wet and dry seasons. Mostly, yeah. Dry season, they might move towards the coast. Rainy season, back to the drier plateau. Except for buffaloes. Apparently they like the wet conditions, so sometimes they'd stay near the coast.
Right.
There's a quote in the sources from Buchanan, writing in the early 19th century about the Golas. He noted they lived near woods, grew some crops, sold milk and butter, had big families where some would herd, others farm, others maybe collect firewood or thatch to sell. Shows that mix of activities again.
It's not just herding, is it? It's often combined with other things, like the banjaras we hear about.
Oh, the banjaras are famous. Found across loads of states, UP, Punjab, Rajasthan, MP, Maharashtra. They moved long distances for pasture, absolutely. But they were also historically crucial traders.
What did they trade?
Plow cattle were a big one, but other goods too. They'd exchange these with settled villagers for grain and fodder for their animals. Real facilitators of trade networks.
And then you have the desert dwellers, like the Raikas in Rajasthan.
The Raikas. Talk about resilience. In Rajasthan, rainfall is so low, so unpredictable, they have to combine cultivation with pastoralism.
How does that work?
During the monsoon, the short rainy season, when there is some pasture available near their villages, they stay put and cultivate. But by October, everything dries up.
So they move out.
They have to. They disperse, moving huge distances, looking for water, looking for forage, only coming back when the next monsoon arrives. It's a tough existence.
And the sources mention different kinds of Raikas.
Yeah, the Maru Raikas, the desert Raikas, specialized in camels. Camels can handle the sparse desert plants, but they need a massive area to graze. Other Raika groups focus more on sheep and goats.
Camels need space.
A lot of space. And the Raikas are known for their camel fairs, too, like at Pushkar or Balotra. They're not just markets to sell animals. They're places to show off their incredible camel training skills.
Wow. There's also a source, isn't there, from the 1850s about Gujars in Kangra.
Right, G.C. Barnes writing about them. He notes some Gujar groups were purely pastoral, living near forests, focused entirely on their buffaloes, selling milk and ghee. The men would be away grazing for weeks, while the women handled selling the produce in markets. Really specialized roles.
So putting it all together, behind this image of just sort of wandering herders, there's this incredibly deep, complex knowledge system.
Oh, absolutely. It takes immense skill. You have to judge pasture quality from afar, know every water source for miles, calculate the timing of your moves perfectly, negotiate access through territories used by farmers or other groups.
Build relationships.
Exactly. Maintain relationships with farmers for grazing rights or trade. And often, you're balancing all this with farming your own small plot, or trading, or craft work. It's a highly sophisticated, dynamic way of life.
But this whole intricate system, built on movement, flexibility, adapting to the environment, it ran headlong into colonial rule, didn't it?
That's where everything changes, dramatically. The colonial state operated on a completely different logic. Their priorities were, well, fundamentally different.
What were they focused on?
Primarily. Increasing government revenue. Land revenue was their main source of finance. And second, expanding the production of agricultural goods they wanted for export back to England. Things like jute, cotton, wheat.
And these vast grazing lands didn't fit that picture.
Not at all. Colonial officials looked at uncultivated land, including pastures, and basically saw wasteland. Because it wasn't generating direct tax revenue and it wasn't producing export crops, it was seen as unproductive, idle.
Just empty space to them.
Pretty much. And they acted on that view. From the mid-19th century onwards, they brought in what they called wasteland rules.
What did those rules do?
They allowed the colonial government to take over these uncultivated lands and grant them to individuals. Could be settlers, could be favored locals with the specific aim of bringing them under the plow, turning them into farmland.
But these were the pastoralists' grazing lands.
Very often, yes. These are the crucial tracts they'd relied on for generations. So the immediate result was a huge shrink in the amount of available pasture.
And on top of losing pasture land, they also faced restrictions in forests, right? Forests were important too.
Hugely important. Fodder, shelter, resources. But then came the Forest Acts, also around the mid-19th century. The colonial administration saw forests mainly as a source of valuable timber, like deodar, sal.
For building ships, railways?
Exactly. Commercial interests. So they started classifying forests. They created reserved forests.
Reserved meaning?
Meaning pastoralists were completely banned, no access. These were forests with the best timber. Then you had protected forests where some traditional grazing rights might be allowed, but movements were severely restricted.
Why restrict them so much?
Well, the official thinking, the Colonial Forestry View, was that grazing animals destroyed young trees. They believed grazing prevented forests from regenerating properly. There's a quote from a forest official, H.S. Gibson, in 1913, basically saying a forest used for grazing can't produce timber or fuel. It was one or the other in their eyes.
So pastoralists lost vital grazing inside forests.
Yes. And even where they were allowed in, say in protected forests, their movements were rigidly controlled by permits.
Permits?
Yeah, you needed a permit that stated exactly when you could enter, when you had to leave, and how many days you could stay. You couldn't just follow the grass or stay longer if the forage was good. You stuck to the permit,
Right.
Or you faced fines, punishment.
It sounds like this fundamental clash. A mobile way of life versus a system obsessed with fixed boundaries, control, paperwork.
There was definitely a deep mistrust, a suspicion of nomadic people in general from the colonial authorities.
Why?
Settled populations were just easier to manage, easier to identify, track, control, and most importantly, tax. Nomadic groups, pastoralists, traveling craftsmen, traders, they were seen as harder to pin down, unpredictable, and often viewed with suspicion. Sometimes labeled as inherently criminal even.
Which led to things like the Criminal Tribes Act.
Tragically, yes. That act, passed in 1871, was a stark example. It classified numerous communities, including some pastoralist groups, as criminal tribes. The implication was that they were criminal by nature, by birth.
That's horrific. What happened to those classified communities?
They were often forced to live in specific notified village settlements. They couldn't leave without a permit. They were under constant police surveillance. It was devastating. And there's a report mentioned in the sources from a royal commission in 1928.
What did it say?
It explicitly linked the loss of grazing land, due to government taking it over, to falling herd sizes, lower earnings for pastoralists, poorer quality livestock, worsening diets, and increased debt. It really highlights that cumulative negative impact.
So, lost land, restricted movement, being branded as criminals, and I bet costs went up too.
You bet. Taxes. The colonial state was always looking for new revenue streams. They taxed land, salt, water, trade goods, and yes, they introduced a grazing tax
On the animal.
on every animal it grazed. Introduced in most pastoral areas from the mid-19th century, and the rate per animal just kept going up.
How did they even collect that?
Initially, the right to collect the tax in a particular area was auctioned off to private contractors.
Oh, I can see where this is going.
Yeah, those contractors had every incentive to squeeze as much money as possible out of the herders to maximize their own profit. It was often brutal.
Did that change?
Eventually, yes. From the 1880s, the government started collecting the tax directly. But it was still a burden. You needed a pass to enter a grazing area. You had to show the pass, pay the tax per head, and the pass would be stamped, noting the number of animals and the tax paid.
So it wasn't just one thing. It was this combination of pressures, less land, less movement, suspicion, taxes all hitting them at once.
Exactly. The combined effect was a serious shortage of pasture. And because movement was restricted, the pastures that were left got overgrazed, continuously grazed, their quality deteriorated. There was no chance for natural recovery.
Which must have weakened the animals.
Absolutely. Less forage, poorer quality forage, meant deteriorating animal health, which then led to massive die-offs, especially during droughts or periods of scarcity. The restrictions made them so much more vulnerable.
It paints a really grim picture, but as you said, the story doesn't end there. How did these communities actually cope? How did they adapt to these huge changes?
That's the really remarkable part of the story, isn't it? They didn't just vanish. Their resilience was and is extraordinary. They found all sorts of ways to cope.
Like what? What were some strategies?
Well, one obvious immediate adjustment was just reducing the number of animals they kept. Fewer animals because there simply wasn't enough pasture anymore.
Makes sense. What else?
Others had to find entirely new pastures when their traditional routes were blocked or lands were taken. They had to innovate, find new paths.
Is there an example of that, finding new routes?
Yeah, the sources mention the Rikas of Rajasthan again. After 1947, with the partition of India and Pakistan, they could no longer take their camels into Sindh province in Pakistan, which had been a crucial part of their traditional grazing cycle for centuries.
So that route was just closed off.
Completely. So they had to adapt. The sources note that in more recent decades, some Rikas started migrating east into the state of Haryana.
Why Haryana?
To graze their camels on the agricultural fields after the harvest.
Ah, like the Dangars and the Konkan farmers. That same symbiotic idea.
Exactly. The camels get the leftover stubble, the farmers get free manure for their fields. It's a modern adaptation, recreating that beneficial exchange in a totally new context because their old options were gone.
That's clever. What about other adaptations? Did wealth make a difference?
It definitely did. The sources suggest that some wealthier pastoralists, those with more resources, were able to adapt by buying land. They settled down, became cultivators themselves, or maybe focused more heavily on trading.
They had options.
They had more options. But for the poorer pastoralists,
It was harder.
much harder. They often faced the worst of it. Many ended up having to borrow money, often from those same wealthier pastoralists or moneylenders. They frequently lost their animals when they couldn't repay debts.
And then what?
They were forced to find other work, became agricultural laborers, working on other people's fields. Or they had to migrate to towns and cities, looking for any kind of work. Odd jobs, charcoal burning, road construction.
So these changes didn't just affect the group as a whole, they actually created new divisions, new inequalities within the pastoralist communities.
Absolutely. That's a really key point. And yet, despite all these immense pressures, losing land, restrictions, taxes, criminalization, new inequalities, many pastoralist communities survived. And in some regions, their numbers have actually grown in recent decades.
That really is a testament to their resilience.
It truly is. They just kept adapting, changing their migration routes year by year, adjusting herd sizes, finding ways to combine herding with other sources of income.
And they started pushing back, right? Engaging with governments.
Yes, actively pressing governments for their rights.
Yeah.
Demanding relief during droughts, asking for subsidies, wanting a say in how forests and water resources are managed. They weren't just passively enduring, they were actively negotiating their place.
So it's crucial to see them not as relics, but as dynamic, living communities.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that today, more and more environmentalists and economists are recognizing that pastoral nomadism, this mobile way of life, is often ecologically sound. It's actually a really sustainable way to use environments like drylands or high mountains, where settled farming just isn't viable.
Okay, so let's take that understanding now and shift continents. Let's look at Africa. Over half the world's pastoral population lives there, right? Something like 22 million people.
Yeah, it's huge. You've got communities like the Bedouins, the Berbers, the Somalis, Boran, Turkana, and Maasai, who provide a really clear case study in the sources.
Living in similar environments, arid, semi-arid.
Predominantly, yes. Raising cattle, camels, goats, sheep, selling milk, meat, hides, and often, like in India, combining herding with some trade, maybe small-scale farming or other jobs.
And, like in India, their lives were profoundly changed by colonialism.
Profoundly. Many of the same kinds of pressures played out, although the specific histories and ecologies are different, of course. The Maasai, living across what's now Kenya and Tanzania in East Africa, are a powerful example from the material we have.
So what happened to their traditional lands, the Maasai lands?
Well, before colonialism, Maasai land was vast. It stretched all the way from northern Kenya down into northern Tanzania, a huge territory.
But then the Europeans arrived.
Then came the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. European powers just carved up the continent. And in 1885, an international boundary was drawn right through the middle of Maasai land, splitting it between British Kenya to the north and German Tanganyika, later Tanzania, to the south.
Just drawn on a map, cutting their land in half?
Effectively, yes. And then things got worse. The best grazing lands within both Kenya and Tanzania were progressively taken over for white settlement, for European farms and ranches.
So the Maasai were pushed out of their best areas.
They were pushed into a much smaller area, often drier, less fertile land. The sources estimate they lost something like 60% of their pre-colonial lands, a massive reduction.
And did the colonial governments also encourage local farming, like in India?
Yes, the British in Kenya particularly encouraged local African groups to take up settled agriculture, often in areas that had traditionally been used by Maasai for grazing. This shrunk the available pasture even further.
Which must have changed local power dynamics, too.
Completely. Before colonialism, the Maasai, with their military strength based on warrior age sets, often dominated their farming neighbors. Colonial rule reversed that. Farmers gained favor, pastoralists lost land and influence.
Weren't huge areas also turned into game reserves, national parks?
Yes, enormous tracts of traditional Maasai land were designated as wildlife reserves. Think of famous parks like the Masai Mara, Samburu in Kenya, the Serengeti in Tanzania.
Those were Maasai lands.
Often prime grazing lands, yes. The Serengeti National Park alone covers over 14,760 square kilometers, much of it former Maasai territory. And once designated as parks, pastoralists were forbidden entry. No grazing their herds, no hunting, often no access at all to areas they'd used for generations.
There are quotes about this, right, from other pastoralists, too.
Yeah, the sources include really poignant quotes from herders in Kaukoland in Namibia talking about these restrictions, saying they feel like they're in jail, unable to move freely to find pasture or trade like they used to. One source even includes a direct instruction from a magistrate in 1937 telling the police to severely restrict movement permits for Kaukoland herders. It was deliberate policy.
Being crammed into a smaller, drier area must have put incredible strain on the remaining land.
Huge strain. The limited land they had left was grazed continuously. This led to deterioration of the pastures, chronic fodder shortages. Just finding enough food for their animals became a constant struggle.
And just like in India, their ability to move, their key survival strategy, was restricted.
Absolutely critical, yes. Nomadism, the ability to move over vast distances to find water and grass, especially during droughts, was fundamental to their survival. But colonial governments, from the late 19th century onwards, confined them to specific reserves.
They couldn't leave the reserves.
Not without special permits. And these were often hard to get, involved bureaucratic hurdles, sometimes harassment. And if you broke the rules, if you moved without permission, the punishments could be severe.
There's a source mentioning police instructions.
Yes, confirming police were told to prevent pastoralists from entering certain areas, especially white settlements, to basically keep their numbers down and keep them contained within the reserves.
The impact during droughts must have been catastrophic.
It made droughts far, far worse, because they were cut off from their best grazing lands, and they couldn't move their herds out of the drought-stricken reserve areas to find forage elsewhere. Huge numbers of cattle died.
Is there a specific example?
The sources point to a particularly severe drought in 1933-34. During that drought alone, over half the Maasai cattle within the reserve perished, simply starved because they were confined and couldn't follow the rainfall or find pasture.
Devastating. And the sources also talk about social changes within Maasai society caused by colonial rule. It wasn't just external pressure.
That's another crucial layer. Colonialism didn't affect all Maasai equally. It reshaped their internal structures, too.
How so? What was the traditional structure like?
Before colonialism, Maasai society was organized around age sets. You had the elders, who formed the ruling group. They made the key decisions, settled disputes in councils. Then you had the warriors, the younger men.
The protectors.
Right, responsible for defending the community, protecting the herds, and also for cattle raiding. Raiding was important. It was how you acquired wealth, cattle, asserted dominance over neighbors, and it was a necessary step to gain status as a warrior. But even the warriors were ultimately subject to the authority of the elders.
The sources describe the warriors' appearance, too.
Yes, very distinctive. The red shuka cloths, the elaborate beadwork, the long spears, the red ochre braided into their hair, and specific rituals, like facing east during ceremonies, long journeys, even symbolic raiding of a homestead entrance as part of initiation. It was a whole system.
So how did the British interfere with that elder warrior structure?
Well, the British didn't really work through the traditional councils of elders. Instead, they appointed individual chiefs for different Maasai sections.
Appointed chiefs?
Yes, individuals they chose who were then made responsible for the affairs of the tribe and reported to the colonial administration. And crucially, the British actively suppressed raiding and warfare.
Which undermined the roles of both elders and warriors.
Exactly. The traditional authority of the elders' councils was bypassed by the appointed chiefs. And the warriors lost their key military and economic function rating. It shook the foundations of the old system.
And these appointed chiefs, did they become powerful?
Many did, yes. They often became quite wealthy. They had a regular income from their position with the colonial government, which was new.
What did they do with that income?
They used it to buy more animals, acquire goods, sometimes even buy land. They also got involved in trade, often living in the growing towns rather than out with the herds all the time. And they started lending money, especially to poorer pastoralists who needed cash, maybe to pay the new colonial taxes.
So they diversified. They weren't just relying on livestock anymore.
That's the key difference. While their families, maybe wives and children, might still manage the animals back in the villages, the chiefs themselves often had these mixed income streams, pastoral and non-pastoral.
Which made them more resilient.
Much more resilient. When droughts or cattle diseases hit, they had other resources. They could afford to buy food or even buy new animals to rebuild their herds after a disaster.
While the poorer pastoralists, who only had livestock,
They were incredibly vulnerable. If they lost their herds in a war or a drought or an epidemic, they lost everything. They didn't have those other resources to fall back on.
so what happened to them?
Many were forced out of pastoralism altogether. They had to go look for work as laborers, working on farms, moving to towns, doing things like burning charcoal for sale, finding jobs on road crews or construction sites, anything to survive.
So colonialism didn't just squeeze them from the outside, it actually created, or at least deepened, this divide inside Maasai society.
It significantly altered the social landscape. The old age-based system wasn't totally destroyed, but it was definitely disrupted. And crucially, this new distinction emerged a growing gap between a wealthier group who managed to adapt by integrating into the colonial economy and diversifying, and a poorer group who remained solely dependent on livestock and often ended up losing everything and becoming wage laborers.
Looking back across both India and Africa then, based on this material, the parallels are really striking.
They really are. Across completely different continents, different cultures, you see pastoral communities facing this remarkably similar set of challenges under colonial rule.
Shrinking access to land,
Severe restrictions on their absolutely essential mobility,
increased taxes.
and deliberate policies designed to control them, reshape their ways of life, undermine their traditional social structures, and all of this made them so much more vulnerable to environmental shocks, especially drought.
And yet, running alongside that difficult story is this powerful theme of adaptation, of resilience.
Absolutely. That's the crucial counter-narrative. They weren't just passive victims. They actively strategized. They found ways to cope, ways to respond,
Changing routes, changing herd sizes.
diversifying their income, finding new ways to make a living, and eventually engaging politically, demanding rights, demanding recognition from the state.
It shows that these traditional livelihoods aren't static things, frozen in time. They evolve, they adapt.
Precisely. And their continued existence, often thriving in really challenging environments, something that's being increasingly recognized for its ecological sense, just highlights the deep knowledge and resilience embedded in these ways of life.
Yeah.
They're absolutely dynamic communities, shaped by history, but very much alive and adapting in the present.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it? The sheer scale of change. The sources show us how policies, often dreamed up far away for economic or administrative reasons, can just fundamentally rewrite the reality on the ground for entire communities.
And create new fault lines, new inequalities, even within those communities themselves.
It's such a powerful illustration of how politics, economics, the environment, and social structures are all tangled together.
Absolutely interconnected.
So, what does this deep dive into the past and present of pastoralists really tell us then? About that complex dance between traditional ways of life, ecological balance, and the huge pressures of political and economic change. That's a dance still happening all over the world today, right?
It certainly is.
And maybe what can their incredible history of navigating disruption, of adapting against the odds, teach us about resilience in our own, rapidly changing world?